Are you familiar with AB 1482? Well, that is the statewide legislation California passed regarding rent control. And whether you're a landlord, you're a tenant, or you're a homeowner thinking of renting, it's very important you know what this legislation means. Hey, this is Jesse with Collins Properties here in Santa Cruz, California, and my goal is to keep homeowners as informed as possible with all things real estate. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down AB 1482, also known as the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, and what it means exactly for landlords and tenants alike. And stay tuned to the end because I'm going to be going over some commonly asked questions such as, what if I missed the deadline to submit the proper exemption language? What do I do then? And I'm also going to be sharing a sample of the exact exemption paperwork you would need as a landlord to submit to your tenants. Now, AB 1482 is rather complex. For the sake of clarity, I'm going to break this video down into three main categories. Number one being whether or not your property falls under AB 1482 itself, and the other two categories pertain to what the law says, namely what it says about rental increases and what it says about just cause evictions. Just cause meaning the tenant didn't do anything wrong, the landlord just wants them out. Now, I want to note one thing. I'm not an attorney. I cannot give tax or legal advice. If you have issues with the tenant or questions about AB 1482 that are not addressed in this video, I highly suggest you reach out to your local real estate attorney. And number two is that AB 1482 is a statewide piece of legislation, but certain townships, counties, municipalities might have more strict legislation that overrides AB 1482, and that is up to you to know your specific area. I know that here in Santa Cruz, we do have more strict legislation. That is called the Relocation Assistance for Displaced Tenants Ordinance, and I will be going over that in the very next video. Now, there is a pretty simple way to determine whether or not your property is exempt from AB 1482, and that falls into two main categories. Now, the first category would be if your property is a single-family home, condo, townhome, or owner-occupied duplex, it is exempt from AB 1482 unless it is owned by a corporation or it is owned in an LLC where one member or more is a corporation. The second category of exemption would be if your home is 15 years old or less. Now, that is a rolling deadline, meaning if your home is issued a certificate of occupancy within the last 15 years, your home would be exempt from AB 1482. For your properties that are exempt from AB 1482, in order to remain exempt, landlords must deliver to their tenants the proper exemption language. This I will be going over at the end of the video, so I will be circling back to that. Now, for a quick summary on which properties are subject to and which are not subject to AB 1482, exempt properties would be any single family home, condo, townhome, or duplex that is owner occupied. Those would be exempt from AB 1482 unless they are held in ownership by a corporation or a corporation is part of the LLC in which holds the title. Now, a frequently asked question we get is, if I own my property in a trust, is it exempt from AB 1482? And the answer to that is yes, as long as the other criteria for exemption from AB 1482 are met. Another question I get is, if I hold this property in LLC, is that exempt from AB 1482? And I would say also yes, as long as the other criteria are met and a corporation is not part of that LLC. Now we are on to our next segment, and that is rent increases. If a property is exempt from AB 1482, theoretically, the landlord is not capped on how much they can raise their rents, and they have no limit to those rental increases. And whether a property is exempt from AB 1482 or subject to AB 1482, once that tenant moves out, the landlord is not limited on how much they can raise the rents. They can raise them up to market rate or above before their next tenant moves in. If a property is subject to AB 1482, those rental increases are limited annually to 5% plus the area's consumer price index or CPI. For example, if I'm a landlord and I want to raise the rent on my tenant, I can raise it up 5%, and then I go check the Bay Area CPI. I see that it is 5% also, and I will raise it up a total of 10%. There is also a stipulation in AB 1482 that caps annual rent increases to no more than 10%. So, for example, if I'm a landlord and I want to raise my rents, I can raise them up 5% max plus the CPI, but if the CPI in the Bay Area is 7%, I can only raise it for a maximum total of 10%. Now, here's an important note that whether or not your property is subject to AB 1482 or exempt, when it comes to tenants that are in a month-to-month tenancy, if your rental increase is 10% or lower, that can go into effect with a 30-day notice. If that rental increase is 10% or greater, you need to give a 90-day notice to your tenant before you can raise the rent. Now, moving on to just cause evictions. Now, like I said, just cause pertains to the tenant not doing anything wrong, the landlord just wanting them out, and the provisions under AB 1482 for a landlord to get his tenant out if his property falls under AB 1482 falls into 4 main categories. So let's look at the law itself to get that clarity. Category 1 is intent to occupy the property by the owner, their spouse, domestic partner, children, grandchildren, parent, or grandparents, and they have to have this clause in the lease in order for them to be able to do that. Very specific. They're not talking about uncles or aunts or anything else. They list exactly the family members, and here is the language right here that you would need to include in your lease. It's very important to keep your leases up to date. Do not use old leases for your new tenants. And this is another reason why it's great to have a property manager. The second category would be withdrawal from the rental market. And once you withdraw that property, you cannot rent it again. You cannot withdraw your rental property to get the tenant out and then put it back on the market. They would have first right of refusal, meaning they would have the option to lease it again if you tried to do that. And the third reason for just cause evictions would be a government or court order mandating that the tenant vacate the premises. Now, that could be for a multitude of reasons. One thing to note is that if the reasons for that mandate are because the tenant is damaging the property or engaging in illegal activities, then the landlord would not owe the tenant any relocation assistance. And number 4 is intent to demolish or substantially remodel the property, which will require permits and require the tenants out for a minimum of 30 days. So if you're just going to be repainting one of the rooms, you cannot move your tenants out. It needs to be a major remodel that requires permits. In all of these cases, besides a court order to evict the tenant, which is due to the tenants damaging the property or illegal behavior, the landlord will owe relocation assistance to the tenant for a minimum of 1 month's rent. Now, this payment can be given within 15 business days of giving the tenant notice or through waiving the last month's rent. Now, keep in mind, with all properties that are exempt from AB 1482, landlords can evict the tenants for any reason, and they do not need to give any relocation assistance. Now, about the question, what if I didn't know about AB 1482 and I didn't get the paperwork over to my tenants in time? What do I do? Well, I will first preface this with consult your attorney. These regulations can vary from county to county, city to city, so it's very important to consult your local attorney, and many will tell you to get this disclosure paperwork over to your tenants as quickly as possible. Now, I don't disagree with that, but let's look a little closer at what the ordinance says. For properties that are exempt from AB 1482, where the tenancy started before July 1st of 2020, that language is not required in the lease, and I would recommend you get that over to your tenants as soon as possible. Now, if tenancy commenced or was renewed after July 1st of 2020, that exemption language was required in the paperwork. You might not be able to get it over to the tenant. I would recommend consulting an attorney ASAP. For any new rental agreements moving forward, that exemption must be in your lease paperwork. This is one of the reasons why I never recommend using old lease agreements or finding those templated lease agreements online. You're just opening yourself up for problems down the road. Now, here is an example of the paperwork that you need to use. It is called the Rent Cap and Just Cause Addendum. If you want to send me an email, I will email you a PDF of this exact paperwork that you can use for your tenancy. You can see on here there is a box to check that you are exempt and you fall into those exemption categories. You want to make sure that box is checked. Now, if you're a landlord and your tenants started their tenancy after July 1st of 2020, or they renewed their lease after July 1st and you didn't give them that exemption language, all is not lost. I know specifically of a landlord I was working for last year whose tenants had renewed their lease after July 1st of 2020, but they were being evicted because my landlord was going to sell. And after consulting with my brokerage in depth, we found that it was quite suitable to hand them the RCJC before we gave them the termination of tenancy paperwork. That worked for us. So all is not lost, but like I said before, please consult with a local real estate attorney for any legal advice. And one thing to keep in mind is here in Santa Cruz County, we do have a more strict ordinance. That is called the Relocation Assistance for Displaced Tenants Ordinance. I'm going to be breaking that down in the next video. If you're a landlord, you're thinking about being a landlord or a tenant, you're not going to want to miss that video. This is Jesse with Collins Properties. Thanks for watching today. I hope you found value in this video. If so, please give me a like and subscribe to stay up to date with more real estate news here in Santa Cruz County. And until next time, stay awesome.